use this mic here? Yeah, so back in whenever it was that we had Situated Technologies, there was vaguely talking about this thing called environment XML, and it was probably not a very well-formed thought that I had. But in the sort of intervening years, it's actually become quite a popular platform now for sharing data. And this is just a screen grab from a website you can actually go to, which essentially shows what we call our fire hose. We're getting about 400 updates per second now from around the world. It works out as about 20 million data points per day from everything from energy monitors to weather stations to pollution sensors to air quality monitors. There are building management systems on there, but also a lot of Arduinos. This and the geographical spread, because we really have sort of got stuff almost all over the world, has given rise to this sort of perception that somehow perhaps Patch Bay's got something to do with what Aaron Strout Pope has referred to the God fantasy of sucking on the fire hose of data, because in the context of this so-called Internet of Things, it's often perceived that what we need to do is simply get more information and then we can make better decisions. This is, of course, the sort of logical continuation of the Enlightenment project, which is all about trying to know every single element of the universe so that we can actually predict what's going to happen next. Now, of course, this is, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but it's better understood now that we don't necessarily make these kind of rational decisions just because we have better information. And as Mark alluded to in the introduction, this project is not so much about making data public, although by default all this data can be shared between participants, but it's very much about the process of the public making data. People being able to take part in the process of measuring their environment, questioning what it is that they're measuring, building their own hypotheses really about what they're seeing out there, and hopefully being able to sort of collaborate on ways of, and this is where it gets important for me, actually making decisions based on that sort of measured process. And I could actually show these.
That I wake up in the morning and my alarm clock went at the right
here.
time because it looked in my diary to know
This
when
is
my first
IBM.
meeting was and had backtracked which ferry I need to get and therefore what time I need to get up.
So the
I
idea
have to
of
leave
connected
5 minutes
sensors is
earlier.
all about efficiency,
Time.
getting to work
All
on
that
time.
stuff is being handled by
This is how
autonomic systems
IBM
of
refers to
little
it. There's
agents
also
looking
the
at.
cliche of the internet-connected fridge, which is going to help your shopping experience improve, as though this is what's important about wiring things up. Fortunately, it's given rise to things like the fuck yeah internet fridge war, which is, because there are really hundreds of these connected fridges now. Philips wants to wire things up because apparently we're not good enough crossing the road without being shown, not by a car that's hurtling towards us, but by LEDs on the ground that are connected to something or sensing something somewhere else. Now the problem with all of these initiatives, it seems to me, is that they're all about basically us as citizens somehow being passive receptors of somebody else's interpretation of a measurement process that was based on sensors that we never knew anything about or had even any sort of qualification to assess in any way. And so we basically just see something that turns into a green or red light that tells us, yes, it's good, no, it's bad. And what I'm much more interested in doing with this system, and which is something I'd like to sort of encourage the participants to do, is actually to build things that help question the standards of evidence, and really to not necessarily supplant so-called official networks, but actually just to tell very different stories. And so, a good example is air quality. Around the world, we have these air quality installations that have been deployed probably by local scientists or local government, and you'll see them distributed throughout the city. Almost always the sensors are placed 3, 4, 5 meters off the ground and equally spaced across the city, because really the purpose of this data collection process is to build up maps of neighborhood resolution air quality information. Basically, this neighborhood is good, this neighborhood is bad. Now the problem with that, of course, is twofold. One is that the information that you get out of this map doesn't help you to do anything, right? You can't just move your flat because you happen to be in a bad neighborhood. The second thing is that it doesn't really tell you what you can do in order to change something, to affect it. And even if you did, you would not be able to detect it in that sort of very sort of low resolution map. But more importantly, those sensors that are sort of 3, 4, 5 meters off the ground, which are placed there for a very good reason from the perspective of the people who have deployed them, namely that you're trying to get a sort of a generalized picture of what's going on. You don't want the sensors down where the pollutants are going to pool along the ground. Those sensors, which are giving what the people who created that network, what they wanted, in order to actually experience that as a human being, I would actually have to be up in the trees, that high up, to be experiencing that in any kind of sort of meaningful human way. Whereas actually down on the ground is where it might be way more important to me, right? In those maxima and minima that the sort of official network has excluded. Because down low is where I might actually be, I might have a child, or I might actually be interested in where those areas are, so that I can make all sorts of decisions. For example, to try and grow something, and then measure whether it's had any kind of air quality improvement. Natalie might be talking about this sort of thing later on. So actually, Natalie and I did a workshop in Barcelona called Qualities of Air, where we essentially, with the students, we're trying to build up many different ways of reading what the air was doing, using ribbons, but also using particle swipes, and measuring the amount of particulate that had deposited on horizontal surfaces. And the point here was that the students could together basically, first off, measure what was going on out there, not just using digital sensors, but actually through collection of the actual physical material that was entering their lungs. They would then collaborate and compare results to build up these kind of maps that are usually used as a sort of visualization tool to say, here's a lot of sexy data. But importantly, the process here was to take that measurement and to try and build up an intuitive understanding of what and how the air actually moved around buildings, through the buildings, so that by the end of it, they were actually sort of proposing, well, if you open up this window and you close that door and you open up that door over there, then we'll actually create a passive airflow that could improve our air quality. And they can then use the same process to measure whether what they've done actually had any effect on it. You might also have heard about the Air Quality Egg, which is a sort of community sort of started initiative to build a citizen-led air quality network. Mark knows about it here on the New York community. Originally it started in the Amsterdam community, and there was then a Kickstarter campaign to try and build this egg, which just closed a couple of days ago. But just to close off, I wanted to recount the story of what happened in Japan last year during the nuclear crisis. There had been a Geiger counter on Patch Bay really almost since the beginning. You can actually see it's feed number 397. And soon after the disaster at Fukushima, this became the most popular feed on Patch Bay. It was being discussed on Twitter and in blogs, and people were sort of pointing at it, trying to infer meaning from what was frankly noise, because this was a Geiger counter that was in a lab behind a concrete wall, 300 or 400 miles away from the disaster site. Now, of course, the fact that this data is made public, it only becomes important because of all the contextual metadata that the owner of that feed had applied. So you could actually start to understand what the context of this data was. But more importantly, from our perspective, it helped to spur on the Japanese community to build better Geiger counter examples around the country, and provide tutorials for how to wire up this device and push the data, how to take this handheld reading and push that data into Patch Bay. They actually bought out the entire stock of SparkFun. And pretty soon, within about sort of 10 days, there were more than 1,000 feeds across the country measuring, in some cases, several times per minute, the radiation levels. Now, at the time, the government was only releasing data at most once per day, usually in PDF format and only in numeric. Basically saying, whatever, 100 microsieverts, which didn't really mean anything to anyone. And there was a strong desire for people to try and understand what was going on. And the government really hadn't been able to release this information. And what's interesting is, and here is the question of the sort of official data set. Often one thinks the official data is somehow cleaner or better calibrated. But in fact, the way that the data had been amassed was, in some prefectures it was measured 80 meters off the ground, in some prefectures it was measured at ground level. There were different models of Geiger counter that were used to measure the data. And so in a sense, the official network of data was slower, worse calibrated, and in fact, and less high resolution than the crowdsourced data set. Now, the important thing to understand is that just collecting this data and publishing it on Patchbay was really not even remotely the interesting part of the equation. What was more interesting was the continued conversations that take place around this that basically spurred on others then to build things like Haiyan Zhang's map that color-coded according to location and based on the difference now to prior to the events. So red was significantly higher than background levels before the event. Yellow was a sort of a medium height. And then to actually introduce the notion of the time, the time element. In other words, how long you're exposed to the radiation, and essentially build up a way of understanding more the health consequences of these numerics, and not just sort of saying it was 50 microsieverts or what have you. Somebody else built the Winds of Fukushima Android app, which took your geolocation and the wind direction of nearby weather stations, coupled with radiation monitors in order to predict where the radiation levels would peak next. And then there are other sort of visualization tools to try and make sense, not of individual data points, because really these kinds of crowdsourced data sets should never be looked at in terms of a single data point at a single location at a single time, but rather to look at trends and to be able to see things like waves of peaks of radiation sweeping across the country that indicate that some catastrophic event had occurred back at the plant. And then a whole host of other sort of applications, including a sort of web form for typing in values if you didn't have a networked Geiger counter, SMS alerts, so that you didn't need to have your own radiation monitor. You could sort of borrow your neighbors, as it were, etc., etc. And just to finish, to say that what all of this work has led us to do is to propose an Internet of Things Bill of Rights. This is about a year old now, and it's actually morphed on significantly, and it's now moved on to a Google group called the Open Data, Internet of Things Open Data discussion. We're basically trying to come up with a Bill of Rights for the data that is generated by these sensors, whether they be those that are acting in public space or those that are behind our own homes and our closed doors. Because in most cases at the moment, that data that's generated by your energy monitor, by your smart grid, by your Fitbit, by your device that's something to do with your digital lifestyle, in many cases, either you don't own that data or you cannot own that data. And people who own those devices are not necessarily clear on that. And so we're going to be having the Open Internet of Things Assembly, hopefully to ratify a set of principles or definitions for the Internet of Things, an open Internet of Things in mid-June. And I would it'd be lovely to have you participating either remotely or in person. Thanks very much.